The beast did not attack her. It merely guarded her with its silent, powerful presence. When the cruel sun's pickup truck engine broke the desert's silence, the tiger, irritated by the interruption of its rest, rose. Its deep growls were not for the elderly woman, but for the intruder who dared disturb its sanctuary. The sun, pale with terror, found himself trapped inside his own vehicle, the imposing beast blocking his escape. Psychological fear consumed him as time passed, until the highway patrol sirens tore through the air, bringing the justice that nature, in its own way, had begun to orchestrate. The sirens tore through the desert's thin air, a dissonant sound that echoed through the rocks and was lost in the yellowish vastness. For the sun, trapped in the terror bubble of his pickup truck, that sound was both a promise of salvation and a harbinger of his end. The police were arriving, and with them the inevitable exposure of his cruelty. But, for now, the most immediate threat was still the imposing beast blocking his exit, an unexpected guardian of his own prison. The tiger, in turn, raised its head again, its pointed ears swiveling to catch the new disturbance. Its growls, previously directed at the vehicle, now became more of an irritated grunt, a warning that its sanctuary was being invaded from multiple flanks. Its amber eyes, previously fixed on the sun, swept the horizon, assessing the new presences approaching. 2 highway patrol vehicles appeared on the horizon, raising a cloud of dust that danced under the relentless sun. At first, the officers, accustomed to accidents and infractions, couldn't discern the bizarre scene awaiting them. As they approached, the silhouette of the pickup truck, the figure of the bound elderly woman, and finally the unmistakable form of the great feline, became frighteningly clear. The cars stopped at a safe distance, tires crunching on the sand and gravel. The doors opened with a dry click, and 3 officers, armed and trained for the unexpected, but certainly not for this, cautiously dismounted. Their faces, previously professional and focused, now displayed a mixture of shock and disbelief. A tiger, in the middle of the desert, beside a bound elderly woman. The scene defied all logic and protocol. "What the hell?" one of the agents murmured, his hand instinctively on his weapon's holster, though he knew a service revolver would be useless against such a creature. The elderly woman, exhausted and dehydrated, but with a new spark of hope in her eyes, watched the events unfold. The arrival of the police was a relief, but the tiger's presence beside her was still a source of latent terror. She didn't know if the beast would protect her, or if, at any moment, it would change its mind and attack her. It was a macabre dance between salvation and perdition. Inside the pickup truck, the sun was sweating cold. The fear of the tiger, which had kept him paralyzed, now mingled with the panic of imminent justice. He could see the officers, their uniformed figures, their confused gazes. He knew there was no escape. The beast had become his tormentor, and now the law was there to seal his fate. He tried to think of an excuse, a lie, but his mind was blank, dominated by the animal's silent roar and the growing sound of his own condemnation. The officers communicated by radio, their voices tense and full of urgency. "Central, we have an unusual situation. Repeat, unusual. A large animal, apparently a tiger, is blocking a vehicle and there's a victim, an elderly woman tied up beside it. We need backup, perhaps animal control, and a medical team." The response from the other end of the line was disbelief, demanding repetitions and confirmations. The tiger, meanwhile, seemed to have made its choice. It didn't advance towards the officers, but it also didn't retreat. Its eyes fixed on the pickup truck, it remained there, a living statue of power and warning. Its tail swayed slowly from side to side, a hypnotic pendulum measuring time and tension. It seemed to understand that the vehicle was the epicenter of the threat to its rest, and its instinct prevented it from allowing the intruder to escape. The officers, with extreme caution, began to move in a semicircle, trying to assess the situation without provoking the animal. Each step was measured, each movement slow and deliberate. The desert's silence, broken only by the wind and the now silent sirens, was heavy, almost palpable. The elderly woman, with a dry throat and cracked lips, tried to get the officer's attention, but her voice was a mere hoarse whisper. The beast, however, had already played its part. It had cornered the human predator and kept him under its watch. Now, the ball was in the court of the law, but how would they deal with such a wild and unpredictable guardian? The tension was a rope stretched to its maximum, ready to snap at any moment, and everyone present knew it. The desert, silent witness to so much cruelty, now prepared to watch the strange justice unfold under its scorching sun. The desert, once a stage for silent cruelty, now transformed into a scene of surreal stalemate. The three officers, figures of authority and order, found themselves facing primal chaos. Their weapons, symbols of human control, seemed pathetically inadequate against the wild majesty of the tiger. They moved with an almost ritualistic slowness, each step calculating the risk, each glance sweeping the scene in search of an opening, a solution. The fine dust raised by their cautious movements danced in the sunbeams, lending the scene a dreamlike, almost unreal aura. The tiger, in turn, was not intimidated. Its amber eyes, which had fixed on the sun in the pickup truck, now briefly acknowledged the new intruders. There was no fear in them, only a calculated irritation, a silent warning that its territory, its rest, was being disturbed too much. Its tail continued its slow, hypnotic sway, a metronome of the accumulating tension. It didn't openly growl at the officers, but the imposing stillness of its presence was a more potent threat than any roar. It remained there, between the bound elderly woman and the pickup truck, an involuntary and unpredictable guardian. Inside the vehicle, the son was in a state of paralysis. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with the dust and forming muddy trails on his skin. His wide eyes alternated between the massive figure of the tiger and the approaching officers. The promise of salvation the sirens had brought now transformed into an inevitable condemnation. He could feel the weight of the law closing in on him. But the most immediate, most visceral threat was still the beast blocking his only exit. A cry of despair formed in his throat, but fear suffocated it, transforming it into a muted, torn sound. His mind, previously focused on his escape and abandoning his mother, now spun in a whirlwind of panic and belated regret. The elderly woman, with a dry mouth and swollen tongue, observed everything with surprising lucidity for her condition. The arrival of the police was a balm for her tortured soul, but the tiger's presence beside her was still a double-edged sword. She felt the heat emanating from the animal's body, the heavy, rhythmic breathing that stirred the air around her. It was an intimate and terrifying proximity, a dance between life and death. Her hope was mixed with a primal terror, a tightrope walk between salvation and perdition. The officers communicated in tense whispers, their voices muffled by the wind. "We can't get too close. He's calm, but he's a wild animal. One wrong move and—" The sentence hung in the air, the implication clear to everyone. They tried to devise a plan, but the situation was unprecedented. How to rescue the victim without provoking the predator, how to ensure everyone's safety. One of them, the most experienced, picked up the radio again. "Central, we need a veterinarian with tranquilizer darts and fast, and a wild animal containment team. Repeat, wild. We can't handle this alone." The urgency in his voice was palpable. The sun continued to punish the desert, raising the temperature to unbearable levels. The air shimmered above the rocks and sand, distorting the landscape and adding a layer of unreality to the scene. The elderly woman felt the dehydration deepen, her vision beginning to blur at the edges. She needed water, medical help. But the tiger, in its silent vigilance, seemed to have frozen time, keeping everyone in a state of suspension. One of the officers, with a slow and deliberate gesture, tried to retrieve a megaphone from the car. The movement, however calculated, was enough for the tiger to react. Its eyes narrowed slightly, and a low, guttural growl escaped its throat, a sound that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. It wasn't an attack roar, but an unmistakable warning. The officer froze, hand outstretched, the megaphone still out of reach. The tiger had made it clear. Any attempt to break the stalemate would be met with a response. The tension became almost unbearable, a rope stretched to its maximum, about to snap. The son in the pickup truck, the officers in their cautious formation, and the bound elderly woman, all were hostages of the exhausted beast that, in its search for shade and rest, had become the arbiter of justice in the desert. Time dragged on, each second an eternity under the merciless sun, as everyone awaited the arrival of backup, the next move in this strange and dangerous chess game between wild nature and human law. The desert, silent witness, seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the inevitable outcome. Time in that merciless desert was not measured by clocks, but by the agony of the sun climbing the sky, burning every fiber of hope. Each minute stretched into an eternity, a silent torment under the heat that distorted the horizon. The air shimmered over the sand and rocks, transforming the landscape into a surrealist painting where life and death danced in a macabre choreography. The tiger, the epicenter of that strange stillness, remained motionless, a sphinx of orange and black stripes, its amber eyes fixed on the pickup truck. Its tail continued its slow, hypnotic sway, a pendulum marking the rhythm of the tension that thickened, almost palpable. Inside the vehicle, the sun was a heap of sweat, dust, and panic. The infernal desert heat added to the fire of his own terror. His throat was dry, his tongue swollen, but thirst was secondary to the fear that paralyzed him. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to flee, to hide. But the tiger was an insurmountable barrier, a wall of muscle and instinct that blocked any escape route. He could see the officers, their uniformed figures, their cautious movements, and knew that the law was closing in on him. The image of his bound mother, previously a distant and cruel thought, now haunted him with painful clarity, mixing with the image of the beast that held him captive. Regret, late and useless, began to gnaw at his mind, but it was a weak feeling compared to the visceral terror of the tiger and the imminence of justice. The elderly woman, in turn, felt the dehydration deepen, every cell of her body crying out for water, her vision at times blurred, and her head spun slightly. But her mind maintained surprising lucidity. She observed the tiger beside her, the heat emanating from its powerful body, the sound of its deep, rhythmic breathing. It was an intimate and terrifying proximity, a dance between life and death. The arrival of the police was a balm for her tortured soul, but the beast was still an unknown. She didn't know if the tiger would protect her from the approaching humans, or if, in a fit of irritation, it would attack her. Hope mingled with a primal terror, a tightrope walk between salvation and perdition. The officers, in their cautious formation, kept their distance, their voices muffled by the wind as they communicated by radio. The central dispatcher's disbelief was evident, demanding repetitions and confirmations of the bizarre situation. Central, I repeat, an adult tiger, yes. A tiger is containing an individual inside a pickup truck and there's a victim tied up beside it. We need specialized support, a veterinarian with tranquilizer darts, and a wild animal containment team. Urgent. The urgency in their voices was palpable. They tried to devise a plan, but the situation was unprecedented. How to rescue the victim without provoking the predator, how to ensure everyone's safety. Their weapons, symbols of human control, seemed pathetically inadequate against the wild majesty of the tiger. The movement of the officer who had tried to grab the megaphone had been a clear warning. The tiger's low, guttural growl had vibrated in everyone's chest, an unmistakable reminder that the beast would tolerate no further disturbances. Now everyone was frozen, waiting. Time dragged on, each second an eternity under the merciless sun, as everyone awaited the arrival of backup. The next move in this strange and dangerous chess game between wild nature and human law. Then, on the horizon, a new cloud of dust rose, denser and faster than the previous ones. Two new vehicles, a utility vehicle with animal control logos, and another, a medical emergency pickup truck, appeared, hurrying to the scene. The sirens, this time, were turned off at a greater distance, a sign of respect for the beast's unpredictability. As they approached, the scene revealed itself to the newcomers in all its bizarreness. A man and a woman, both dressed in containment uniforms and carrying specialized equipment, dismounted from the animal control vehicle. Behind them, a paramedic and a nurse, with their first aid kits, assessed the situation with wide eyes. The woman, a serious-faced veterinarian with her hair tied back, was the first to speak, her voice calm but authoritative. "What's the exact situation?" "Officers?" One of the officers, the most experienced, pointed to the tiger. "He's been there for hours, Doctor. He's cornered the guy in the pickup truck. The elderly woman is tied up next to him, but the tiger hasn't attacked her. It seems to be protecting its resting place." The veterinarian raised binoculars, observing the beast with professional intensity. A Bengal tiger, exhausted apparently, but still dangerous. Any sudden movement and it could react. She noticed its tail swaying slowly, its eyes vigilant. It's in territorial defense mode. The vehicle and the individual inside it are the perceived threat to its rest. The containment team began to unpack their equipment, a tranquilizer dart rifle, capture nets, and a reinforced transport cage. The plan was clear, but the execution a monumental challenge. "We need a clear shot," said the man from the containment team, adjusting the rifle's scope, but without startling it, "and the elderly woman is too close." The tension increased, if possible. The elderly woman, noticing the movement, tried again to get the officer's attention, a hoarse whisper of "water." The paramedic made an instinctive move, but was restrained by the veterinarian. No, any movement towards the elderly woman could be interpreted as a threat by the tiger. It's protecting her, in a way, by keeping everyone away. The son in the pickup truck watched the dart rifle being assembled, and a new kind of panic invaded him. Would he be the target or the tiger? And what if the tiger was hit and reacted violently? His mind spun in a whirlwind of catastrophic scenarios. The desert, once a stage for silent cruelty, now transformed into a scene of surreal stalemate, where human law and wild nature confronted each other, mediated by an exhausted beast and a defenseless elderly woman. The sun continued to punish, and the rope of tension, stretched to its maximum, seemed about to snap at any moment. The decision was made. The tiger needed to be tranquilized. But how? And what would happen in the next instant? The decision had been made, heavy like the sun burning everyone's skin. The tiger needed to be tranquilized, but the question hanging in the air, hotter and more suffocating than the desert itself, was how? And what would happen in the next instant when the dart hit that mass of muscle and wild instinct? Dr. Elena, the serious-faced veterinarian, lowered her binoculars, her eyes scanning the scene with calculated intensity. She was a professional accustomed to dealing with wild animals, but never in such a precarious scenario, with a human life tied just inches from the predator. "It's exhausted, dehydrated, but still a wild animal at the peak of its strength," she murmured to her team, her voice low and controlled. "Any false move, any unexpected noise, and we could have a tragedy." The man from the containment team, a burly fellow named Marcos, adjusted the tranquilizer dart rifle, checking the pressure and sedative dosage. "Doctor, the elderly woman is too close. We don't have a clear shot without risk of hitting her, or of the tiger reacting and injuring her before the dart takes effect." Elena nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I know. We need a plan that minimizes risk to the victim, and to us." She looked at the officers. "Officers, we need absolute silence. Any communication, only by radio and in whispers. No one moves without my order." Inside the pickup truck, the son watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and terror. The dart rifle. That weapon wasn't for him, but for the tiger. And what if the tiger was hit and, in its last moments of consciousness, turned on him, or on his mother? Sweat ran down his face, mixing with the dust and dirt. His mouth was dry, but fear was a more potent poison than thirst. He could see the determination on the professionals' faces and knew the end of the stalemate was near. But would it be his end too? The image of his mother, once so insignificant, was now a ghost that haunted him, mixing with the tiger's menacing shadow. The elderly woman, in turn, felt life slowly drain away. Dehydration was a veil covering her mind, making sounds muffled and images distorted. But she still felt the tiger's warmth beside her, the heavy, rhythmic breathing that was her only company. She noticed the movement, the new faces, the rifle. A primal instinct warned her of imminent danger. Would it be the end or salvation? She tried to speak again, a hoarse moan that was lost in the wind. "Water." Dr. Elena knelt, taking a water bottle from her backpack. "We can't give her water now. The risk of choking or of the tiger reacting is too high. We need to tranquilize it first." She gestured to Marcos. "Marcos, I need you to position yourself there, behind that rock. Try to get an angle that minimizes risk to the elderly woman. If the tiger moves, even slightly, that will be our chance." Marcos nodded, moving with agonizing slowness. Each step calculated not to raise dust or make noise. The dart rifle seemed an extension of his body as he positioned himself, eyes fixed on the beast. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the buzzing of insects and the blowing wind. Dr. Elena took a small laser and pointed it at the tiger, tracing an imaginary line on the animal's striped coat. Ideally on the thigh or shoulder, an area with good muscle mass. She waited. The tiger, oblivious to the drama unfolding around it, continued to sway its tail slowly, its amber eyes fixed on the pickup truck. It was the king of that piece of desert, and everyone else was merely an intruder. Minutes dragged like hours, each second a torture under the merciless sun. The air shimmered, distorting vision, making the scene seem even more unreal. The elderly woman felt her head spin, her vision darkening at the edges. She was on the verge of collapse, but an inner strength, an ancient stubbornness, kept her clinging to consciousness. Suddenly, the tiger moved, just a slight adjustment of position, a stretch of one of its front paws, exposing a little more of its flank. It was the chance. "Now," Elena whispered, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Marcos, who already had the rifle aimed, held his breath. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the target. The dart, loaded with a potent tranquilizer, was ready. There was a faint puff as the dart was fired, an almost inaudible sound that in the tense desert silence seemed like thunder. The projectile flew in a straight line, a tiny speck against the golden desert backdrop, and hit the tiger with a soft thud on its hind thigh. The tiger reacted instantly, not with a furious roar, but with a violent start. Its muscles contracted, and it rose in a single fluid motion, eyes wide, searching for the source of the sting. Its eyes found Marcos, and a low, menacing growl escaped its throat, louder this time. Full of fury and confusion, everyone's heart pounded. The son in the pickup truck screamed, a sound muffled by the glass. The elderly woman, even in her semi-conscious state, felt the vibration of the growl and the animal's sudden movement. Primal terror overwhelmed her. The tiger took a step towards Marcos, but the sedative was already beginning to take effect. Its movements became slow, clumsy. The fury in its eyes began to be replaced by a strange drowsiness. It staggered, its head heavy, and let out a confused grunt. The powerful body began to give way. Dr. Elena, with adrenaline coursing through her veins, shouted, "It's falling! Containment team, prepare the nets! Officers, keep your distance, but be ready!" The tiger, in a last effort, tried to stay on its feet, but its legs buckled. It collapsed heavily to the ground, inches from the bound elderly woman, raising a cloud of dust. The sound of the impact was dull, but it resonated in everyone's soul. Its breathing, previously rhythmic, became slower and irregular. Its amber eyes closed. Silence returned, but now it was a silence of relief and expectation. The tiger was down. But had the threat truly passed, and the elderly woman? The rope of tension, which had been stretched to its maximum, now seemed to have snapped, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty and the urgency to act. The silence that followed the tiger's fall was not one of peace, but of tense, almost palpable expectation. The massive feline's body lay inert, but the threat, the shadow of its freshly contained fury, still hung in the scorching air. Dr. Elena was the first to break the spell, her voice firm, though adrenaline still coursed through her veins. "Containment team, now! Quick, but with caution!" The men of the team, trained for moments like this, acted with impressive synchronicity. Reinforced nets were thrown over the sleeping tiger, binding its paws and body to ensure that, should the sedative begin to wear off sooner than expected, it couldn't react. Every movement was precise, calculated, as the striped mass was immobilized. The animal, even unconscious, exuded an overwhelming presence, a vivid reminder of the strength they had just subdued. While the containment team worked on the tiger, Dr. Eleanor turned to the paramedics. "Go! The elderly woman needs immediate attention." The paramedic and nurse, who had waited with bated breath, rushed towards the elderly woman. Relief was visible on their faces, but the urgency was even greater. The woman was pale, her lips cracked, her body weak and trembling. With quick, experienced hands, the paramedic began to untie the ropes binding the woman to the rock. Each untied knot was a small triumph against the cruelty that had confined her. The nurse, in turn, was already preparing a saline drip and a cup of water. "Mom, can you hear me? We're here to help you." Her voice was soft, but full of compassion. The elderly woman opened her eyes with difficulty, her vision blurred. She saw the worried faces, the hands that freed her. A faint moan escaped her lips. "Water," she whispered again, her voice almost inaudible. The nurse brought the cup closer, offering small sips. The water, cool and life-saving, trickled down the woman's dry throat, a balm for the thirst that had tormented her for hours. Every drop was life, a slow and painful return from the brink of the abyss. Meanwhile, a few meters away, the police were acting. The officers, who had kept their distance during the standoff with the tiger, now approached the pickup truck. The son, who had watched the entire scene with wide eyes of horror and fascination, was cornered. The tiger's threat had disappeared, but a new and inevitable reality imposed itself. He saw the officers approaching, weapons drawn, their faces serious. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. The panic that had dominated him during the confrontation with the beast now transformed into a cold, bitter despair. He tried to start the engine, a last futile act of rebellion, but the car didn't respond. The battery perhaps exhausted by time, or perhaps it was just fate manifesting itself. "Exit the vehicle with your hands on your head." The officer's voice was clear and authoritative, cutting through the air like a whip. The son hesitated for an instant, his gaze sweeping the desert, searching for an exit that didn't exist. The image of his mother, now being attended to by paramedics, and that of the tiger immobilized and asleep were the silent testimonies of his own ruin. With a sigh of defeat, he opened the pickup truck's door and stepped out, hands raised above his head. His steps were slow, dragging, a man broken by his own cruelty and by nature's unexpected intervention. The officers handcuffed him without resistance, the coldness of the metal on his wrists a brutal reminder of the end of his freedom. Dr. Elena observed the scene, a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction in her gaze. The tiger was safe, and the woman, though fragile, was alive. The containment team was already preparing the transport cage, a robust and ventilated container, to take the feline to a rehabilitation center. The animal would be assessed, treated, and eventually relocated to a safe and suitable environment. The elderly woman, now lying on an improvised stretcher, was receiving intravenous fluids. Her eyes, previously lifeless, began to show a faint glimmer of consciousness. She looked at the tiger, still immobilized, and then at her son, who was being led away by the officers. There was no anger in her gaze, only a deep sadness, the pain of a betrayed mother. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the desert with shades of orange and purple. The scene, once a nightmare of abandonment and danger, now transformed into an epilogue of rescue and justice. The desert, silent witness to so much cruelty, now saw redemption, proof that even in the most inhospitable places, life finds a way to defend itself and justice to manifest. The tiger, the improbable guardian, rested, its duty fulfilled, and the desert, finally, breathed a collective sigh of relief. Twilight painted the desert with hues of farewell, but activity at the scene was far from diminishing. The containment team, under Dr. Elena's watchful eye, moved with the precision of a somber ballet. The tiger, still under the sedative's effect, was carefully hoisted by an adapted winch, its striped mass swaying gently in the air before being lowered into the transport cage. It was a robust container designed to ensure the safety of both the animal and the humans involved. Every tightened bolt, every checked latch, was a step away from danger, a step towards rehabilitation. Elena watched, her heart still beating a rapid rhythm. The sight of the majestic feline, now vulnerable and asleep, evoked a complex mixture of emotions. There was the relief of having averted a tragedy, the professional satisfaction of a successful rescue, but also a pang of sadness at the irony of the situation. A wild animal, forced to intervene in a human dispute, becoming the improbable guardian of a life. She approached the cage, her hand hovering over the bars, feeling the residual warmth of the tiger's body. "You're a good boy," she whispered, a silent promise of a better future for the feline. The plan was to take it to a specialized center, where it would be evaluated by experienced veterinarians, treated for any injuries, and eventually reintroduced into a suitable habitat far from human cruelty. Meanwhile, a few meters away, the woman was the center of meticulous care. The paramedics worked with moving dedication, the nurse adjusting the IV drip, the paramedic checking her vital signs. The elderly woman's pale skin began to regain a healthier tone, and the glimmer in her eyes intensified with each passing minute. She was lying on a stretcher, covered by a thermal blanket that protected her from the cold that began to descend with the night. The cup of water, now empty, rested beside her, a symbol of her slow recovery. The woman looked at the darkening sky, at the first stars that dotted the immensity. Her mind, previously clouded by dehydration and shock, began to clear, bringing with it the painful memories of abandonment. But, strangely, there was not only pain, there was also the image of the tiger, its imposing and, paradoxically, protective presence. Like a wild angel, it had appeared out of nowhere, a shield against the wickedness of her own blood. A solitary tear trickled from the corner of her eye, not of sadness, but of profound and incomprehensible gratitude. She had been saved by a beast, and not by her son. This truth, bitter and sweet, was a heavy burden on her heart. The paramedic, noticing her vigil, spoke softly. "You're in good hands now, Mum. We're taking you to the hospital for a full evaluation." She nodded weakly, her voice still a whisper. "Thank you. All of you." The gratitude was genuine, her voice choked with emotion. The nurse smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "It's our job, ma'am, and you are very strong." Far away, under the intermittent lights of the police sirens, the son was subjected to the first legal procedures. Handcuffed, he sat in the back seat of a patrol car, head bowed, his face a mask of despair and contained rage. The officer filled out the forms, his voice monotonous, listing the charges: abandonment of an incapacitated person, attempted murder, mistreatment. Each word was a hammer, pounding on the reality of his situation. He tried to argue, to stammer excuses, but the words were hollow, weightless, in the face of the gravity of his actions. The officer merely looked at him with an expression of disdain and weariness, a man who had already seen the worst of human nature. The son looked out the window, at the desert that became a dark silhouette against the starry sky. The pickup truck, now evidence, was parked a few meters away, a silent reminder of his cowardice. He saw the stretcher with his mother being carried to the ambulance, the fragile but living figure, and further away, the cage where the tiger was being prepared for transport. The feline, the unexpected hero, the pivot of his ruin. A cold rage began to bubble within him, mixed with the fear of what would come next. There was no remorse. Only the fury of having been caught, of having been thwarted by something so, wild. The ambulance turned on its lights, preparing to leave. The police car would do the same shortly, taking the son to a cold, solitary cell. The desert, which had witnessed horror and miracle, began to calm down. The vehicles, the people, the lights were like a wound slowly closing, leaving behind only the marks of an extraordinary story. The night wind began to blow, carrying with it the last echoes of tension, adrenaline, surprise. The dust settled, and with it the certainty that justice at times chooses the most improbable paths to manifest. And that nature, in its silent wisdom, can be the most relentless and the most compassionate of judges. The desert, once the stage for a cruel drama and an unexpected miracle, now stretched under a blanket of stars, the lights of rescue vehicles and police diminishing in its vastness. Three destinies, once intertwined by a thin thread of life and death, now separated, each following its own path into the darkness of the night. In the ambulance, the constant hum of the engine and the gentle swaying of the vehicle were the woman's only companions. Lying on the stretcher, wrapped in the thermal blanket that protected her from the growing desert cold, she watched the road lights pass quickly by the window. Her eyes, previously clouded and lifeless, now carried a glimmer of consciousness, but also a deep melancholy. The paramedics worked in silence, monitoring her vital signs, adjusting the saline drip that slowly trickled into her veins, a river of life bringing her back from the brink of the abyss. The nurse, with a gentle touch, checked her forehead, offering another sip of water, which the woman accepted with a weak nod. Her mind, though still fragile, began to process the events of the last few hours. The image of her son, his cold, determined eyes as he tied her to the rock, was an open wound in her soul. But strangely, this pain was interspersed with another image, more vivid and paradoxically comforting, that of the tiger. The beast, with its striped coat and amber eyes, which had appeared as an improbable guardian, a wild angel amidst her misfortune. How was it possible that a wild animal could demonstrate more compassion, more protection than her own son? This question lingered in her mind, a heavy burden, but also a source of strange and profound gratitude. She had been abandoned by her own flesh and blood, but saved by a creature of nature, The world, in its complexity, had revealed itself in a way she could never have imagined. A solitary tear trickled from the corner of her eye, not of sadness for the betrayal, but of an exhaustive relief and a gratitude that transcended logic. She was alive, and that, for now, was all that mattered. In another direction, in the police car, the son followed his own path to inevitable justice. Handcuffed in the back seat, head bowed, he watched the dark desert pass by. There was no remorse in his gaze, only a cold rage and a simmering resentment. He replayed the events, not with guilt, but with the fury of a frustrated plan. The tiger. Always the damned tiger, the wild creature that had interfered in his affairs, ruining his freedom, his future. He had planned everything, calculated every step to rid himself of the burden his mother represented. And then, out of nowhere, a beast exhausted by the heat, seeking shade, had become the pivot of his ruin. The officer at the wheel maintained a heavy silence, which only increased the tension in the small space. The patrol car's radio crackled occasionally, but the words were unintelligible to the son. He knew what awaited him: charges, interrogation, prison. The coldness of the metal on his wrists was a constant reminder of his new reality. He tried to find an excuse, a justification in his mind, but the words seemed hollow, weightless, in the face of the gravity of his actions. He did not feel guilty, only betrayed by luck, by nature, by everything. The desert, which he hoped would be the tomb of his secret, now became the silent witness of his failure and his condemnation. Rage mingled with the fear of the unknown, of what would come next. The future, once so clear in his selfish mind, was now a dark and menacing fog. In parallel, in a specialized transport vehicle, the tiger also followed its path. Dr. Elena, sitting beside the robust cage, observed the sleeping feline. The sedative was still taking effect, keeping the beast in a deep, peaceful sleep. The faint light inside the vehicle revealed the majesty of its coat, the strength of its musculature, even in repose. Elena felt a bittersweet mixture of admiration and relief. The animal, which had been a symbol of danger and mystery, was now a patient, an improbable hero who deserved a second chance. She thought about the irony of the situation. A wild animal, driven by the instinct of self-preservation, had become the guardian of a human life, while the victim's own son had revealed himself to be a crueler predator. Nature, in its silent wisdom, had corrected a human error. The plan was to take it to a wildlife rehabilitation center, where it would be evaluated by experienced veterinarians, treated for any stress or injury, and eventually reintroduced into a suitable habitat, far from the cruelty and madness of men. Elena caressed the bars of the cage, a silent promise of a better future for the feline. It had fulfilled its duty, and now it was the humans' turn to fulfill theirs. As the vehicles moved away from the desert, the lights of civilization began to appear on the horizon, a reminder that the outside world awaited with its laws, its hospitals, and its prisons. The desert, which had been the stage for a nightmare and a miracle, now returned to its ancestral quietude, the stars witnessing the end of one chapter and the beginning of others, each loaded with the scars and hopes of an extraordinary night. The dust settled, and with it the certainty that life, in its most diverse forms, always finds a path to justice, even if that path is trodden by striped paws and a wild heart. In the ambulance, the constant rhythm of the engine and the gentle swaying of the vehicle were the woman's only companions. The lights of the road passed quickly by the window, a blur of approaching civilization. Lying on the stretcher, wrapped in the thermal blanket, she observed the outside world with eyes that, though still tired, carried a glimmer of consciousness. The nurse, with a gentle touch, checked her forehead, offering another sip of water. Every drop was a small miracle, a reminder that life, however fragile, still pulsed within her. The ambulance finally stopped. The doors opened, revealing the cold brightness of a hospital. Hurried voices, the clinking of medical equipment, the smell of antiseptic. She was gently transferred to a hospital stretcher, pushed down white, sterilized corridors. A doctor with a serious demeanor examined her, asking questions about her name, her age, what had happened. She answered in whispers, the words heavy, but the truth, however harsh, needed to be told. With each detail, each memory of the desert, the pain of betrayal mingled with the strange serenity of having been saved by a beast. The doctor nodded, his expression mixing professionalism with a hint of incredulity. "You are very strong," he said, the same words as the nurse in the desert, but now they resonated with a new depth. She was strong, yes, but that strength had been found in the most improbable of companions. The patrol car stopped in front of a police station, a building of dark bricks and barred windows. The officer at the wheel maintained a heavy silence, which only increased the tension in the small space. The doors opened and he was led inside, the cold metal of the handcuffs on his wrists a constant reminder of his new reality. The booking process began. Photos, fingerprints, the filling out of forms that listed the charges in cold, impersonal language. Abandonment of an incapacitated person, attempted murder, mistreatment. Each word was a hammer, pounding on the reality of his situation. He tried to find an excuse, a justification in his mind, but the words seemed hollow, weightless in the face of the gravity of his actions. He did not feel guilty, only betrayed by luck, by nature, by everything. The desert, which he hoped would be the tomb of his secret, now became the silent witness of his failure and his condemnation. Rage mingled with the fear of the unknown, of what would come next. The future, once so clear in his selfish mind, was now a dark and menacing fog, a labyrinth of cells and interrogations. The vehicle finally arrived at a wildlife rehabilitation center, an oasis of care and hope. The tiger was carefully unloaded, the cage sliding smoothly into a quarantine area. Veterinarians and technicians awaited, ready for the initial assessment. While still sedated, the feline was examined, its vital signs monitored, its physical condition evaluated. There were no serious injuries, only the exhaustion from the heat and stress. The plan was clear: recovery, observation, and eventually reintroduction into a suitable habitat, far from the cruelty and madness of men. Elena caressed the bars of the cage, a silent promise of a better future for the feline. It had fulfilled its duty, and now it was the human's turn to fulfill theirs. The tiger, the catalyst of unexpected justice, was now in a sanctuary, its journey back to freedom beginning under the watchful eye of those who understood its intrinsic value. As the night advanced, the three destinies consolidated in their new scenarios. The woman in the hospital faced physical and emotional healing. The son in the police station confronted the consequences of his wickedness. And the tiger in the rehabilitation center began its journey back to the wild. The desert, which had been the stage for a nightmare and a miracle, now returned to its ancestral quietude, the stars witnessing the end of one chapter and the beginning of others, each loaded with the scars and hopes of an extraordinary night. The dust settled, and with it the certainty that life, in its most diverse forms, always finds a path to justice, even if that path is trodden by striped paws and a wild heart. In the sterile silence of the hospital room, Donna Clara began her slow and painful journey of recovery. Each day was a small step, a colossal effort against the exhaustion that still weighed on her body and the pain that gnawed at her soul. Nurses came and went, their gentle whispers and careful touches were a balm, but they could not erase the images that repeated in her mind. The desert, the merciless sun, the ropes tightening her wrists, and above all, the face of her son, devoid of any emotion as he abandoned her. It was a wound that would not heal, a betrayal that defied the very nature of maternal love. But as a strange and powerful counterpoint, the image of the tiger also persisted. Its amber eyes, the warm breath on her face, the silent protection it offered. How was it possible that a wild animal driven by instinct could be more compassionate than her own flesh and blood? This question haunted her, a cruel irony that redefined her understanding of the world. She had been saved by a beast, while her son, to whom she had given life, had tried to take it. Days turned into a routine of exams, medications, and inevitably, interrogations. Detectives, with their calm voices and penetrating gazes, asked her to recount the events. Each word was an effort, each memory a new blow. She described Ricardo's meticulous plan, the journey, the desolate landscape, the moment he tied her to the rock. With each detail, her voice faltered. But the truth needed to be told, not for revenge, but for an intrinsic need for justice, and perhaps to make sense of it all. She felt no hatred, only a deep sadness, and an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. The betrayal of a son was a heavier burden than any rock in the desert. Meanwhile, in a cold and impersonal cell at the police station, Ricardo faced the reality of his actions. The rage that consumed him was not of remorse, but of frustration. His plan, so perfectly orchestrated, had been ruined by an aberration of nature, a tiger that should not have been there. He refused to cooperate, answering investigators' questions with sarcasm and stubborn silence. In his distorted mind, he was the victim, not his mother. Society, the police, even the damned tiger, all conspired against him, preventing him from achieving the freedom he believed he deserved. The charges were heavy: abandonment of an incapacitated person, attempted murder, mistreatment. His lawyer, a designated public defender, tried to explain the gravity of the situation, but Ricardo barely listened. He was trapped in his own bubble of resentment, unable to process the reality that his life, as he knew it, had come to an end. The handcuffs, the smell of disinfectant in the cell, the authoritative voices of the police, all of it was a constant reminder of his new and unwanted reality. The future, previously a clear path to an inheritance and a life without burdens, was now a dark fog of hearings, trials, and most likely years in prison. In parallel, at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, the tiger began to awaken. The sedative, which had kept it in a deep and restful sleep, slowly wore off. Its amber eyes opened, blinking against the soft light of the quarantine enclosure. The smell of disinfectant and other animals, strange to its natural habitat, filled its nostrils. It rose cautiously, its powerful muscles still a little stiff, and explored the new environment with the innate distrust of a predator. The concrete walls, the robust bars, the clean floor, everything was different from the sand and rocks of the desert. Dr. Elena, observing it through a safety glass, felt a mixture of fascination and concern. The tiger was magnificent, a perfect specimen of its species, but also a wild animal that had gone through trauma. The veterinary team monitored every movement, every sign of stress. They knew that reintroduction would not be simple. The animal would need to readjust to wildlife, but away from the human interference that had led it to this situation. Elena thought about the feline's journey. From an exhausted predator seeking shade, it became an improbable guardian, a catalyst for justice. Its presence in the desert had unmasked human cruelty and revealed nature's capacity to intervene in unexpected ways. Now, it was the human's responsibility to ensure it had the chance to live the life it was entitled to, far from the madness and wickedness it had witnessed. She promised herself that she would do everything in her power to ensure that this tiger, this hero of stripes and claws, found its way back to freedom, to a place where it could simply be a tiger, wild and free. As the woman healed, the son faced justice, and the tiger adapted to a new beginning. The desert, the stage for it all, returned to its quietude. But the settling dust carried the stories of an extraordinary night, a reminder that life in its most diverse forms always finds a path to justice, even if that path is trodden by striped paws and a wild heart, and that human wickedness, however calculated, rarely escapes its own destiny. In the hospital room, the morning sun filtered through the blinds, painted patterns on the walls, but could not dispel the shadows that still inhabited Donna Clara's soul. Physical recovery, though slow, progressed. External wounds healed, pains diminished. But the deepest wound, that caused by her own son's betrayal, remained open and throbbing. She spent hours in silence, her eyes fixed on an invisible point, reliving the moments in the desert. It was not an exercise in masochism, but an attempt to understand, to make sense of the madness. Psychologists who were now part of her support team spoke of resilience, of processing trauma. But how to process the idea that the person you loved and raised with your whole being could wish for your end in such a cruel way? The image of Ricardo, with his impassive face as he tied her up, was a constant ghost. However, alongside this dark image, there was another, that of the tiger. The warmth of its body, the deep breathing, the silent presence that in some inexplicable way had protected her. It was a dichotomy that haunted and comforted her at the same time. Nature, in its savagery, had been more compassionate than humanity. She began to accept visitors, first from the hospital staff, then from close friends who, with looks of pity and shock, tried to offer words of comfort. Donna Clara merely nodded, her answers monosyllabic. But each day, a small part of her inner strength seemed to return. She knew she had a choice, to succumb to bitterness or to find a new purpose, and surprisingly, the image of the tiger was the compass that guided her. It, a wild being, had shown her that life, even in the most adverse circumstances, could offer a chance for a new beginning. She didn't know how, but she felt she would need to honor that lesson. Meanwhile, in the cold corridors of the courthouse, the farce Ricardo had built in his mind began to crumble under the overwhelming weight of the evidence. The first hearing had been just a prelude. Now, the process advanced, and every testimony, every document, every piece of material evidence painted an undeniable picture of his premeditated cruelty. The testimonies of the highway patrol officers, the 911 recording, Donna Clara's detailed description, everything aligned to seal his fate. Ricardo, handcuffed, sitting between his lawyer and the officers, maintained an expression of defiance, but his eyes, once full of fury, now revealed a glimmer of despair. Rage still simmered, but it was an impotent rage, contained by the bars and the relentless machine of justice. He still clung to his narrative of victimization, blaming the tiger, the system, his mother, anyone but himself. His lawyer, a tired but diligent man, tried, in a low voice, to explain the gravity of the situation, the limited options, the need for some cooperation. But Ricardo ignored him. His mind trapped in a vicious cycle of resentment, the prosecution left no room for doubt. The intent of abandonment and attempted murder was clear. The fact that Donna Clara had been found tied up, without water, under the scorching sun, was irrefutable proof. The future he once imagined of luxury and freedom now transformed into an arid landscape of cells, monotonous routines, and the total loss of control. The irony was cruel. He had tried to abandon his mother in the desert to get rid of a burden, and now he himself became a burden to the system, abandoned to his own fate, but without the dignity of a wild animal. Far from human cruelty and judicial bureaucracy, at the rehabilitation center, the tiger continued its journey of adaptation. The quarantine enclosure, though spacious, was a stark contrast to the vastness of the desert. It explored every corner with caution, its keen senses picking up the smells of other animals, the muffled sounds of human activity. Dr. Elena and her team observed it through the glass, noting every behavior, every sign of adaptation. The feline, a majestic predator, demonstrated remarkable intelligence, but also a subtle restlessness. Its amber eyes, which had witnessed human cruelty and the fragility of life, now reflected a mixture of curiosity and a deep longing for freedom. Elena felt a special connection with that animal. It was not just a patient, it was a symbol, a living reminder of nature's capacity to intervene, to correct the imbalances caused by human wickedness. The reintroduction plan was underway, meticulously crafted to ensure that the tiger could return to its natural habitat, away from any human contact that could corrupt its wild instinct. They knew the journey would be long, but they were determined. That tiger had fulfilled its role as guardian, as a catalyst for justice. Now, it was their turn to be its guardians, to ensure it had the chance to live the life it was entitled to, a life of freedom and dignity in the heart of the wild. At the hospital, Donna Clara received news about the tiger. Dr. Eleanor had made a point of visiting her, sharing the feline's progress and the plans for its reintroduction. A faint but genuine smile lit up the elderly woman's face. It was news that brought hope, a sign that, despite all the darkness, life found its way. She asked Elena to somehow convey her gratitude to the animal. An impossible request, perhaps, but one that carried the weight of a life debt. The desert, stage of so much pain and an unexpected miracle, continued its silent dance with time. The dust now not only covered stories but also marked the beginning of new chapters. Donna Clara, her heart still heavy, but with a glimpse of peace, began to rebuild her life. Ricardo in his cell faced the inevitability of his destiny, his rage transforming into a cold despair. And the tiger, the guardian of stripes and claws, was about to return to freedom, carrying with it the secret of an extraordinary night and the proof that nature, in its primordial wisdom, always finds a way to balance the scales of justice. The silence that settled was not of oblivion, but of a new beginning, where each one, in their own way, faced the consequences and promises of an uncertain future. In the chilling corridors of the courthouse, the air felt dense, heavy with anticipation and imminent gravity. Ricardo, with bloodshot eyes and a pale face, felt the net closing in. The farce he had built, brick by brick, crumbled under the overwhelming weight of the truth. There was no longer room for denial, for the victimization that had comforted him so much. The testimonies, the evidence, his mother's choked voice recorded on 911, everything aligned to seal his fate. His lawyer, with an almost inaudible sigh, made a last desperate plea for clemency, for human fragility, for the complexity of family relationships, but the words seemed empty, without echo, in the face of the exposed cruelty. The judge, an imposing and impassive figure, read the sentence. Each word was a blow, a hammer that shattered Ricardo's last defenses, abandonment of an incapacitated person, aggravated attempted murder. The magistrate's voice was firm, without hesitation, detailing the premeditation, the absence of remorse, the coldness of the act. Ricardo listened but did not fully comprehend. His mind, accustomed to distorting reality, struggled to assimilate the magnitude of the conviction. Years, many years, freedom, luxury, the future he had planned, all dissipated like a mirage in the desert. A muffled cry escaped his throat, a mixture of rage and despair. He tried to stand up, to protest, to blame, but the officers beside him restrained him with silent force. His eyes, once full of arrogant fury, now reflected a chilling terror, the brutal understanding that he had dug his own grave. The irony was cruel. He had tried to rid himself of a burden to achieve freedom, and now he himself became a burden to the system, condemned to a life of bars and deprivations, without the dignity of a wild animal fighting for its survival. Justice, slow and relentless, had found its way, and Ricardo finally confronted the mirror of his own darkness. Far away in the hospital room, Donna Clara watched the sunlight dance on the walls. News of Ricardo's conviction had arrived, but it did not bring the catharsis many expected. Instead of relief or revenge, she felt only an emptiness, a profound sadness for her son's wasted life. The wound of betrayal still hurt, but no longer with the acute intensity of the first few days. Therapy, conversations with psychologists, and above all, the memory of the tiger were slowly stitching the fissures in her soul. She had made a decision. She would not succumb to bitterness. Life had given her a second chance, an unexpected miracle in the heart of the desert. She would honor that chance. She began to make plans, small steps towards a future that, though uncertain, would not be defined by the cruelty of the past. She thought about volunteering, reconnecting with old friends, rediscovering joy in small things. The image of the tiger, majestic and protective, was her compass, a reminder that strength and resilience could emerge from the most unexpected places. Dr. Elena, visiting her, brought with her the contagious energy of hope. She described the final preparations for the tiger's reintroduction, the remote sanctuary, the vastness that awaited it. Donna Clara's eyes shone with genuine emotion. She asked Elena to, somehow, convey her gratitude to the animal, a life debt that could never be repaid but would be eternally remembered. Elena nodded, promising that the spirit of that gratitude would accompany the feline on its journey back to freedom. And the day came. Dawn painted the sky with shades of orange and purple as Dr. Elena's team prepared for the most important mission, the tiger's return to nature. The quarantine enclosure, which for weeks had been its temporary home, now seemed too small for the grandeur it represented. Carefully sedated, the feline was transferred to a special transport crate designed to ensure its safety and comfort during the long journey. The journey was silent, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the tiger's deep, rhythmic breathing. Elena felt a bittersweet mixture of emotions. There was pride in having fulfilled her mission, in having been part of something so significant. But there was also the farewell, the awareness that this majestic being, who had become a symbol of justice and hope, was about to move away forever from human influence. Upon arriving at the sanctuary, a vast stretch of untouched land, with winding rivers and dense vegetation, the sun was already high. The team worked with precision and reverence. The crate was positioned in a clearing, facing the lush forest. Elena, with a heavy heart, gave the signal. The crate door opened slowly, revealing the darkness within. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, a slow movement. The tiger emerged, its amber eyes blinking in the sunlight, its striped body stretching in a lazy yawn. It inhaled deeply, its keen senses picking up the smells of damp earth, leaves, the wild life around it. There was no hesitation in its movements. With innate grace, it took its first steps into its new home, a predator at the peak of its form, finally free. Elena watched it disappear among the trees, a powerful silhouette merging with the landscape. A tear rolled down her face, not of sadness, but of deep joy and fulfillment. The tiger had fulfilled its role as guardian, as a catalyst for justice. Now it was where it belonged, an indomitable spirit in the vastness of nature, a living reminder that however dark the paths of humanity, the silent wisdom of nature always finds a way to balance the scales. Months passed since the tiger disappeared into the green vastness of the sanctuary, a powerful silhouette that merged with the landscape, carrying with it the secret of an extraordinary night. The silence that settled was not one of forgetting, but of a new beginning, where each, in their own way, faced the consequences and promises of an uncertain future. For Donna Clara, the new beginning blossomed slowly, like a desert flower that resists aridity. She left the hospital, not for the house Ricardo had coveted, but for a small, cozy apartment, bathed in the morning sun. The physical scars had healed, but those of the soul would take longer. However, she was not alone. The therapist helped her untangle the knots of trauma, and the memory of the tiger, once a terror, had transformed into a talisman of strength. She began volunteering at a community center, her wrinkled hands, once tied, now busy knitting blankets for newborns. In each stitch, in each loop of wool, she wove a piece of her new life, an act of love and resilience. The laughter of the children at the center was a balm, and the gratitude in the eyes of the parents she helped was a mirror of her own journey. She no longer felt the need for revenge against Ricardo. The pain of betrayal still existed, but it was now a dull, distant ache, eclipsed by the light of her own rediscovery. She had chosen life, hope, kindness, and that choice was her greatest victory. Far away, in his cold and impersonal cell, Ricardo faced a different desert, a desert of concrete and solitude. The rage that had driven him for so long had transformed into a chilling despair, a bitterness that corroded his soul. The days dragged on, indistinguishable from each other, punctuated only by the creak of the bars and the echo of his own choices. He had dreamed of freedom and wealth, but had found only confinement and spiritual poverty. There was no tiger to save him there, no divine intervention, only the relentless justice of men. His eyes, once full of arrogance, now carried the weight of belated regret, not for the harm he had caused, but for the freedom he had lost. He was a prisoner of his own actions, condemned to relive, in his mind, every detail of that night in the desert, the image of his defenseless mother and the menacing shadow of the feline that had sealed his fate. The irony was a slow poison. He had tried to rid himself of a burden to achieve freedom, and now he himself became a burden to the system, condemned to a life of bars and deprivations without the dignity of a wild animal fighting for its survival. Doctor. Elena continued her passion for wildlife, but the experience with the tiger had etched a new depth into her soul. The feline story, though kept confidential in its most intimate details, became a silent legend among her team. She used the metaphor of the unexpected guardian in her conservation lectures, inspiring others to see nature not only as something to be protected, but as a source of wisdom and balance. With each reintroduction project, with each animal she helped return to its habitat, Elena felt the tiger's presence, a reminder that life, in its wildest form, possessed an intelligence and a capacity for justice that transcended human understanding. She visited Donna Clara regularly, and in each conversation, in each shared smile, the bond forged in the desert strengthened. The woman's gratitude was a gift, an acknowledgement that sometimes the greatest miracles come wrapped in stripes and claws. And the tiger? It thrived in its new sanctuary. Monitoring cameras recorded its presence, an orange and black spot moving with grace and power through the dense forest. It hunted, drank from the clear river waters, and rested under the shade of the trees, a king in its domain. Its roar, occasionally captured by microphones, was a sound of freedom, a hymn to wildlife. It was no longer the exhausted and disoriented feline of the desert, but the personification of nature's indomitable force, a free spirit that had fulfilled its purpose and now lived its own truth. It was living proof that nature, in its primordial wisdom, always finds a way to balance the scales of justice, to protect the innocent and to confront darkness with an unexpected light.